By Macron talking about the potential, even the potential for putting Western boots on the ground, he opens up the option that anything could be on the table. But that plan is a 3-point plan. It's 1.5 pages. First point is kill Hamas.
Whoever you feel the sets of enemies are, they absolutely hate each other. So, and war in that region has been going on for thousands and thousands of years.
A container ship, apparently there were 2 anti-ship missiles fired at it. One of them just plopped in the water. The other one did actually hit.
Sure, Macron in France the other day said something like everything from now on has got to be on the table, which means delivering military support to Ukraine, possibly boots on the ground. Is he scared? Is he just setting the hair running? What's happening?
It made headline news, didn't it? There was lots of the newspapers had headline news about this. That some stories NATO reining back in France, some saying no, there's no suggestions of boots on the ground. I think what's fascinating here, though, is that this was following a group of Western leaders that were discussing support for Ukraine, and the harsh reality is that Ukraine needs weapons. The EU has agreed a slug of money, but historically they don't actually have many weapons left to provide Ukraine. America, another big slug of money, similar scale, but about half of that was expected to be military support. At the moment, there's no prospects of that American support actually coming through. Ukraine needs weapons today. The fall of Avdiivka, which we covered last week, Russia has continued to move forward. Even though it's in the middle of winter, even though it's really difficult to do that, they're capitalizing on the fact that Ukraine doesn't have weapons. And effectively, what President Macron was saying was, if we do nothing, Russia will prevail. So at the start of this war, we gave Ukraine anti-tank missiles, but wouldn't give them anything else. Then we said we'd give them tanks. Then we gradually grew confidence and we gave them long-range missiles, but we said you're not allowed to use those missiles to attack on Russian soil. And we said there's no way we put a no-fly zone in there. By Macron talking about the potential, even the potential for putting Western boots on the ground, he opens up the option that anything could be on the table. And I think what's happening here is the West is trying to explore, we may not be able to suddenly generate a load of weapons overnight, but are there other things that we can do to make Putin think? And a no-fly zone is one of them. We discussed that with Greg earlier. Another way, though, is to say, right, these long-range missiles we're providing you, you can target what you like.
Even I know that if we do any of those things, then actually we're very close to being, or are being, at war with Russia.
Well, it's nuanced, though, isn't it? I mean, the very fact that we're providing tanks, does that mean we're at war with Russia? We're providing long-range missiles. Does that mean we're at war with Russia? We provide a lot of weapons to countries around the world. So for a long time, we were providing weapons to Saudi Arabia. They were at war with the Houthis in the Yemen. Does that mean that we were at war with the Houthis? No, it doesn't.
Well, I mean, if you give them a gun and you put a Ukraine guy behind the gun, and he pulls a trigger, that's Ukraine.
Yes.
If you give him a gun and you put a French guy behind the gun, then...
I absolutely agree. So if you put boots on the ground, once you've got people on the ground, I agree. You're into a different world then. But in a way, even that's nuanced, because if Russia attacks Ukraine and there are French people there helping to defend Ukraine, is that Russia picking a fight with France, or is that France simply standing with Ukraine to help them defend themselves? And I think things like giving Ukraine long-range missiles but saying you can use them how you want to use them, yes, it's a slight escalation, but it's not going to war with Russia. It's saying, you can buy weapons off the open market and use them as you see fit. We've restricted what you can do with them up till now. But actually, if I'm a Russian commander and I know that Ukraine struggles to target anything inside Russia, I'm going to mass my army, I'm going to mass my logistics just across the border, and then flow that through at a time and place of my choosing. If I know that you've got a missile that can come a couple hundred miles into Russia, that's going to make me think a bit. It's going to change the dynamics of how you run the war. And it's just fascinating to see how these things are all designed. Putin is always going to threaten. He threatened nuclear war, didn't he? He threatened if the West got involved. But we didn't go into nuclear war. You know, this is a bully trying to keep the odds on his side. And I think all Macron was doing was just going, hang on a minute. If we're serious about this, if we want to stop Putin and we can't find the wherewithal to give the weapons that Ukraine needs, is there anything else we can do? And it's caused a storm, but probably a very welcome one.
So it looks like there is an end game at play. We've got a hostage deal on the table, not a complete one, but a partial one. And presumably there's going to be some sort of statement on, what next. Is all this, are they sort of playing at it, or do you feel this is beginning to look like the end?
I have to say I'm a bit sceptical at the moment, largely because it doesn't feel like Prime Minister Netanyahu, his heart is in this at all. It feels like he's been coerced into trying to placate American concerns, Israeli concerns. Bluntly, as a military guy, you want to maintain momentum. The Israeli Defense Force went through the north, through the middle of Gaza. They're now on the cusp of going to the south. They've got momentum. They've got Hamas on the back foot. Why would you stop? Well, you stop because there's growing international concern of this escalation. The Houthis attacking the Red Sea. That Hezbollah's going mad in the north. We've now hit the horrible milestone of 100,000 Palestinian casualties. 30,000 deaths, 70,000 injured. Half to two-thirds of those are children. 100,000 casualties. And the international community said, if you now go into Rafah, the Israelis go into that southern area, clear the last 4 battalions of Hamas fighters, you've got all those civilians, 1.3 million refugees. How on earth are you going to differentiate? There's going to be what some of the UN have described as a bloodbath.
Yeah.
And also Israelis are going, more needs to be done to get the hostages out. So all this pressure is around Netanyahu, who's looking increasingly isolated. And it feels like he's obliged to generate enough time to develop a plan to get rid of the refugees so he can get into Rafah, and also potentially
get some of the people out,
get some of the hostages out. But the numbers we're talking about, I think there's 132 hostages. Not all of them are going to be alive, are believed to still be around. We're talking about 40 apparently. Kids under 19, women over 50s, and the sick is what they're talking about getting rid of. They're talking about 10 to 1, so 10 Palestinian prisoners being released for every one hostage, humanitarian aid, all that sort of thing. Now, there are some positives from Israeli perspective, because by pausing the fighting, they've been fighting since early October. It will give their forces, the Israeli forces, a chance to get a breather, have some rest, rearm, and also develop a plan for how they're going to go in. The trouble is that also provides the same opportunity for Hamas.
For Hamas, yeah. So Israel's got a 3-point plan for the end.
Well, it was fascinating news this week when Netanyahu finally came out with here's my vision for how this is all going to end. And I have to say, from a military perspective, I found that somewhat frustrating, because you should have had that right at the start, because that creates the conditions that the military go out and say, right, we know what you're trying to achieve. We will provide the military conditions to do that. But that plan is a 3-point plan. It's 1.5 pages. First point is kill Hamas, destroy Hamas. Is that going to be possible? Secondly, we need to have some sort of governance arrangement by administrators that have never had anything to do with Hamas, but they need to be quite good at administration, and we need to select them. And thirdly is the Israelis need to have free access to anywhere in Gaza, in a demilitarized zone, so that they run the security.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even if they actually, I don't think it's possible, got rid of every single Hamas soldier, terrorist, whatever you want to call them, as we've said before, the fight isn't really with Hamas. The fight is with, in my opinion, Iran. So you've still got Lebanon, Hezbollah, still got Yemen, Houthis, and who else, and that means there's going to be some sort of continuance of some sort. So you can kiss goodbye to the other two objectives, because it won't be Hamas you're negotiating with. Actually, in a proxy sense, it'll be somebody else.
But it's also, what's the peace plan? You've fought, you've won your battle. I mean, Hamas is no match militarily for the Israeli Defense Force. There's an air of inevitability in this final chapter of the war. But once that fighting's been finished, what next?
These whoever you feel the sets of enemies are, they absolutely hate each other. So, and war in that region has been going on for thousands and thousands of years. Doesn't sound very hopeful to me, sadly.
No, it doesn't. And I think the tragedy is the point you're making, I think, as well, is that the Israelis and the Palestinians will not be able to come to a peaceful accord. There's some visceral hatred there. That's not going to happen. Any peace accord has to look after both parties. So Israel's worried about its security concerns. Palestinians also have a justifiable need to worry about their security concerns. Israel worried about their prosperity. That needs to be the same conversation. And at the moment, if you're only looking at it through the Israelis' lens, you're building the friction. You're not solving the problem. And I think we've said before, just because if one Hamas fighter remains alive, and the tunnels that are under Gaza, at least half of them apparently are still in Hamas's hands. Some of them go underneath the Egypt border. So it's quite likely that some of the Hamas will flee under the border and then come back in again once the war is over. So you're not going to solve that problem.
No.
And is Israel going to be any safer as a result of this?
Well, I'll tell you what, that is very, very depressing.
Well, it is if the international community does not step up, because it's very unlikely that Hamas and or the Palestinians, the Israelis will solve this. They need money to rebuild Gaza. In the past, that's been Arab state money, but that will only come with certain caveats of security, etc. Governance, American influence with Israel. In the past, I thought that was a powerful influence. I'm less sure now, given the way this is going. The role of the international community, I won't use the word impose, but finding a way to create a more enduring, peaceful solution of coexistence. And my experience of politicians is their attention will quickly flit onto something else. And this is not going to be an easy thing to solve. But if the political imperative isn't there to dig in, to do it properly, I've got this horrible foreboding about that we're going to be having exactly this conversation again in a few years' time.
So the people in Gaza are in desperate need of help at all levels, from hospital supplies at one end to just basic food, sanitation material at the other, and everything in between. It's taken a long time for everybody to wake up to bringing supplies and aid to them. And now we've got airdrops happening, Sean. But overall, why is it taking so long?
What's fascinating is that, as you say, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is awful. Now, first of all, the international community, there's no shortage of aid being pushed towards Gaza. So there's no shortage of intent, and there's definitely a need. So the challenge is, how do you actually get this aid that's available in? The issue clearly is the border crossings and then distributing the aid from there. It's worth setting the context here, so around some numbers. So before the 7th of October, the international community was helping Gaza routinely with 500 trucks of aid every day. That was the need. Now, since the 7th of October, it's been very difficult to get aid in at all. At the peak, they were getting around 40% of that aid in. In other words, about 200 trucks a day. And that was during the last operational pause. You remember the pause in the fighting that was happening? Some days, though, there's been less than 10 trucks of aid going in.
And where's that been coming from?
Well, most of it's been coming through the land crossing, but there's three ways really of getting it in: air, land and maritime. So let's look at those in term. Air, the best way of getting aid is to land it at an airport, pull it out the back, get airborne again. Remember the Berlin, airdrops and whatever? It was all landing, throw it off the back.
And the planes they used for this?
Well, at the time, it was all transport aircraft. But obviously in Gaza, the Gaza International Airport was closed in 2001, 2 years after it was opened, and it now lies in ruins. So there isn't an airport available to do that. By maritime, that's where most of the bulk of world goods travel by sea, because a ship can carry thousands of times more cargo than an aircraft can. The trouble is Gaza doesn't have any significant ports. It's got little fishing ports, but nothing that will take a big ship. So a ship would have to go into Egypt. Then, of course, it would be loaded onto trucks. And now you're into the third dimension, which is via land. And the trucks, unfortunately, need a crossing point. There's only 2 crossing points, really, that Israel's left open. One of those Rafah, one of them's Kerem Shalmon, which is down in the south. And those are both controlled by Israel. As a result, they're not letting much aid through at the moment.
And what's the difference between stuff coming on a truck and stuff being delivered, I guess, only now from airdrops?
Well, the airdrop, I think one of the reasons we've been fascinated by it is that it creates really good pictures, it's imagery, it shows that the West is helping. The problem with airdrops, they're actually quite dangerous in this environment, not only for the people on the ground, but let's look at the aircrew first. You are moving a lot of weight of an aircraft, the freight in the aircraft, from the front of the aircraft to the back. It's going out quickly, so the centre of gravity of the aircraft changing rapidly. You've got lots of crew in the back that are having to be bolted in as this stuff goes flying past them. It's all quite dangerous. And the aircraft's in a war zone, so it's got to fly low and slow to get this stuff out, and that makes it vulnerable. Now, there are ways of doing it from 25,000 feet with, I think it's called JPADs. It's a precision parachute system that can fly these pallets down to the right position.
So if it's low level, it's just dropped? Just
literally thrown out the back in a line. And that brings on that second point, which is it's indiscriminate. It goes out in a strip. There's some imagery, I hope we'll be able to show it, that shows that some of the aid that was dropped by air went into the sea. Now, some of it, I understand, was recovered, but it's pretty indiscriminate as to where it falls. Thirdly is that in my time in the military, when we were distributing aid, the first thing you did was put a secure environment on the ground so you could get the aid and then control the distribution of it. So it goes to those people who need it. Whereas if you don't have that environment, which you don't with an airdrop, it just drops all over the place.
Goes to the enemy.
Well, it goes to those who are strongest. Those who are able to get to it, and they actually are probably not the people who need it. It's the weak or the sick that actually need it. But the big issue for me about the issue between land and air is you look at a C-130, the Hercules. We saw the Jordanians using Hercules for airdrops. It looks very impressive, but each of those Hercules carries 1 truckload of aid. Remember, Gaza needs 500 a day, so that's 0.2% of the daily requirement of aid.
So and it's good PR then.
So you have to conclude that it's not a very effective way of doing it. It's almost certainly, as you say, political. It's politically motivated. The US wants to, demonstrate it is concerned, but also it bypasses Israel holding the checkpoints, and therefore it's very much a political gesture.
So back to your point about it's the strongest who get it. Seems to me the strongest people in Gaza are actually Hamas. Now, call me a cynic, but my fear there is that if Hamas are the first ones to it, whichever way it comes in, and it's their job to distribute, there is a view that Hamas will take it for themselves first before their people actually get it.
That may well be true, and that predominantly seems to be the reason that Israel's using for claiming that they don't want aid to flow into Gaza, because if you're simply giving it to Hamas, you're perpetuating the war, not bringing it to an end. The problem is that it's the aid agencies that are operating in Gaza talk about there's 2.3 million people who used to live in Gaza. 1.3 million of them have been moved down to the south. They're mainly living in tents, destitution, haven't got food, haven't got medicines. Humanitarian disaster arriving there. Do you, not provide aid because some of it might end in Hamas's hands?
It's wicked.
It's
wicked.
It's absolutely wicked.
Yeah. I mean, just sort of digging into the Hamas thing a bit more, it was clear after October what was going to happen. That, you know, the attack was so heinous, it was obvious this would trigger Israel into a war. So that must have been known by Hamas and actually by Iran. So after spending billions and billions on a tunnel system, which is twice the size of the London Underground, why didn't they stock up with a year's supplies? I don't know. A lot more could have been done, given they knew there was a war coming and a war of attrition as well.
Well, yeah, I think that most of the prevailing view is that actually Hamas did stock up. There's no suggestions that Hamas is short of supplies. Some of the pictures that the Israelis have shown of the tunnels that they have captured show huge number of supplies
For them?
for Hamas,
Right.
because they were looking to prevail. Now, there have been several reports that say Yahya Sinwar, who's the boss of Hamas, hails from Khan Yunis in the sort of southern part of Gaza, that he never expected the level of retribution that Israel has reached. So they were prepared for a conflict. But if you look back over the last few decades, these things tend to be Israel responds, the international community intervenes, and it stops. That's what they were expecting. They were not expecting that Israel would declare war and then systematically work their way through. And I think that's been a surprise for Hamas and their planners.
He's an idiot then. Because
Well,
it was big what happened. Whichever way you look at it, it was big. So he was a fool if he didn't expect this.
Well, the trouble is you're back into the do the ends justify the means,
yeah.
and now having set this train in motion, at the moment we're still not really sure how it'll end. What was the horrors is that we've now passed the milestone of 100,000 Palestinian casualties, and however you dice it, a small proportion of those Hamas fighters, according to the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Authority, at least a half are women and children who culturally almost certainly not part of Hamas. And the humanitarian disaster, which is befallen Gaza, almost certainly will end up with significantly more casualties than ever been caused by the war because of disease, malnutrition, lack of operations, the like. So it's an absolute travesty, whatever the outcome of the war. The humanitarian disaster is just horrible. And part of the challenge here is how do you solve that? First of all, it's a symptom. You can't solve it until the war's over and then you have to move in. The only answer, from my perspective, is to open up the land crossings. What's interesting in the north of Gaza, because although there's a huge number of people in Rafah, there's also a load of Palestinians living in the north of Gaza, or existing rather than living. There's a crossing point in the north called the Erez crossing. That was closed on the 7th of October after the attacks. If Israel was to open that up, it would allow the flow of aid in. They don't want to do that.
Well, in my view, it's never going to end unless the many sides in this agree they can all coexist in harmony. It's a different topic, but unless we get that, my view is this will never end. And that means bringing Iran into the sort of punishment, as opposed to just, what's going on.
It's definitely a topic for a much bigger debate.
Yeah,
and I say, at the moment, I just think what's been interesting this week, from my perspective, particularly as an airman, particularly as I've been in the back of these aircraft when you're putting out aid, it's quite a dynamic exercise. It's relatively dangerous. It works really, really well when you're in Africa somewhere and a community has been flooded. They're 1,000 miles away from civilization. You need to get aid to them, and you need to get aid to them fast. Airdrops are fantastic because you can get there quickly, you can drop it nearby, it doesn't endanger anybody, and it gets really quick supplies. It isn't the answer in one of the most densely populated regions of the world. It is a political gesture, not a military gesture. And it's a really difficult sticky plaster. It's not solving the problem.
So as depressing as it is, the future from an aid point of view is very uncertain.
Absolutely.
Sean, there's a word you use, which I'm going to borrow, which I absolutely love, and the word is schwack. Okay.
Schwack.
Schwack. And that's what the West has been doing with the Houthis. They've been hitting all the targets that sort of pop up and throw missiles or whatever, launch drones. And you would expect for the Houthis, a smallish group, not overwhelming in terms of the power and so on, you'd expect their ability would be going that way at every level, volume, accuracy, the whole thing. Actually, they seem to be being more successful and, actually being just a little bit more than an irritant as well. So is that true? I mean, why is that?
Yeah, I think it is. I think you're absolutely right. So the Ruby Mile was the ship that eventually got sunk. That sank a few days ago. But also the Houthis earlier on this week claimed that they'd managed to hit another vessel, the Swiss-owned MSC Sky 2. It was a big container ship. Apparently there were 2 anti-ship missiles fired at it. One of them just plopped in the water. The other one did actually hit this ship. Now, we understand that a fire broke out on board. We understand that there were no casualties, and also that this ship just has continued on its way. The US conducted a series more strikes against the Houthis. But as you say, what's been fascinating is that right at the start, when the Houthis started firing anti-ship missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones at shipping, they were firing a lot of them, and nothing really seemed to hit anything. Since then, the US has been consistently striking, and the US and UK have been doing very high-profile strikes, not only against the missiles, but also the launchers, the radars, the storage facilities. So you'd imagine that they wouldn't have had the capability anymore. Yet, from a military perspective, their effectiveness is improving. And I think you have to conclude, when you look at this objectively, the only way they could do that is with help. It's one thing having a missile. It's quite another knowing how to use it most effectively, because part of it is how do you identify a target?
There's a lot of high tech and high tech thinking going into not just the missiles, but everything else to the point of launching, going into it.
No, you have to. So you've got to. Where is the target? You've got to identify it. Then you've got to track it. Then you've got to find out how do you launch the system? How do you make sure it's locked on? And how do you make sure it gets to the target with a degree of redundancy? There's a lot of moving parts there, and a lot of that requires intelligence. It requires it's not just firing the missile. There's a lot more to it than that. And I think where you look most likely as what's happened, you would have expected a reduction in the capability. What's happened is quite the opposite. What's happened is improvement, and that only happens when you get help. And bluntly, you get help by chatting to the people who supply the weapons and the people who manufacture the weapons.
Yeah.
On both these cases, the finger points at Iran. So somehow Iran is helping now the Houthis, not just supplying these weapons, but also helping them target more effectively merchant shipping in the Red Sea.
Yeah, well, we've said before, I think the real enemy actually is Iran. But do you remember the phrase, the mother of all battles? This was Saddam Hussein's threat to the West. If you dare attack me, you're going to get the mother of all battles. And I mean, he actually fell over quite quickly. And maybe they thought that's what happened with the Houthis, but it hasn't.
No, I think Houthis is a different one, because this was more about trying to dissuade them. The first element was deter the Houthis, because it's one thing firing a few missiles at ships because the West, what can they do? Well, actually, if the West does actually say, look, we warn you, if you carry on, and they carried on, okay, now we're going to demonstrate that we can hit you and hurt you. They didn't try and defeat the Houthis, they simply tried to deter them, and that was the initial strikes. They carried on. Okay, so the next stage from deter is actually to degrade. So all of a sudden, the Americans said, we're not just going to hit the weapons, we're going to hit the launchers, the radars. So as soon as the radar pops up, it leaves a signature, which the American satellite system can track, so you know exactly where the radar is, so you can schwack it. The word again. But you can also, where the storage systems are for their weapons. You know where the command and control centers are. So now you can hit all of those. So even if the Houthis still want to have a go, they struggle to have a go. But even then, they've continued. And that seems to imply that they're, getting a lot more supplies in to replace, but also the very fact their effectiveness, because the Houthis aren't known for their satellite intelligence and all of the rest of the elements that are involved in these sorts of operations, it is a marked improvement in their effectiveness, which is a real concern for the West.
Yeah, so this is going to be an underlying, continuing sort of trend, which doesn't show any sign of, abating, despite the West's best efforts. Something else which may be a lot more worrying has happened, and I think you've got some data, so maybe it's accidental, but nonetheless still worrying, that some of the cabling, data cabling, has been damaged, cut in the Red Sea.
Yeah, there's a lot of data cables that run all the way down the Red Sea. And last month, the Yemeni government said that the Houthis were planning to sever some of the data cables. Now, it turned out that late in February, they're not exactly sure when, that 3 of those fibre optic cables were damaged and severed. Now, 97% of the world's internet and data flows through these undersea cables, and therefore having 3 of them out takes about 25% of the capacity away. Now, that affected not the UK, but it affected the Middle East, it affected Asia, and it affected some parts of Africa as well. But a really worrying sign. And and of course, they can be repaired. The trouble is that because of the security situation there, you're not about to launch a ship in there to start repairing them just yet. Now, we may never know what actually caused it. First of all, undersea cables, if they're deep, they're quite difficult to target. And a lot of the Red Sea, it can go down to 3 kilometers deep. But what's interesting is that about a quarter of the Red Sea is only less than 50 meters deep. And that starts to get into scuba territory. I'm a qualified scuba diver, and about 30 meters, you're into one of those areas where scuba can get involved. And if you look at the Ruby Mar, there's pictures of the Ruby Mar on its side that you can see it resting on relatively shallow water. So it would be within the Houthis' ability if they wanted to. But it is worth I did a bit of research on this, and globally there are 150 incidents a year of undersea cables getting damaged or ripped apart.
By?
Well, so the vast majority of those are done by merchant fishing vessels with their nets and the equipment, particularly that rolls along the floor. And the second one is by anchor dragging. In other words, an anchor that's just been gradually tugged along the ocean floor that catches them. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because the Ruby Mar, the ship that was sunk by the Houthis, was hit at about the middle of February. It didn't sink until last weekend. And it was abandoned pretty quickly, and it was on anchor ever since that time. Now, I'm not a sailor, and I thought if you're on anchor, it might move a little bit. But actually, that ship moved over 60 kilometers under anchor. In other words, that ship was dragging an anchor for 60 kilometers. When you look at the ground track of when it was hit to the point at which it's sunk, that track takes you directly across where these undersea cables lie. Now, I'm not suggesting for any moment that I know that's the reason, but I have to say, if you look at the stats, it looks very likely that the data cables were in fact damaged or severed by the anchor dragging, of the Ruby Mar when it sunk, before it sunk. And it just shows the unintended consequences of a war between Israel and Hamas that leads to the involvement of Houthis that then starts to impact on the internet usage and business data in nations as far afield as South Africa and the Middle East.
That is, accidental or not, it does open up how exposed we are to data, information, and actually now energy. I mean, some energy travels on, cabling under the sea, historically. Now, of course, with North Sea wind farms and so on, a lot of our energy travels on cables under the sea. If you go back to my younger days, when I supplied computer systems to the power grid, there were 100, 110 power stations, all individual, the grid. It was quite difficult, to knock it out. I'm not harking back. Now, with a concentration in wind farms and big thick cables under the sea, if Putin happens to be listening to our podcast, he won't need us to tell him that is a single point of failure to the UK and our energy security, including data. So although this may be not about that, I think for us that's actually quite a major issue, and it's an exposure and a vulnerability.
It's definitely something that we're going to talk about more as part of defence, because remember the pipelines, the gas pipelines that were disrupted, still not proven who it was, but it does show that somebody can target gas pipelines and has a strategic impact on the cost of living around the world. Data, we take for granted now using our business cards. You're involved in the business. We are utterly dependent now. And if you're a military guy, if I'm doing a military campaign I'm looking for their centres of gravity. I'm looking for the things that they're most vulnerable. And it isn't now just about soldiers fighting soldiers. It's about how do you wage a war to win. And part of that is about the information space. Part of that is about the energy space. Part of that's around the data space. And things like these cables, they lie under the oceans. But how do you protect them?
It's a massive issue. Well, in a way, you can't. You can't. If they're even if they're deep, as you said, I think they are vulnerable. And the volume of data, now particularly with artificial intelligence, remember back to the conversation with Marshal Greg Bagwell, the volume of data is now hundreds of thousands of times more than it was in the recent past. And therefore, we are reliant on much bigger volumes travelling down single points of failure. Remember Greg saying, the future wars, they're not going to be bombing stuff they're bombing now. They're going to go for Bill Gates' server farm in the Nevada desert.
No, exactly right. And I think that's where trying to be aware in this world of technology, I think what's fascinating about this discussion is that I'm a Luddite of the Cold War. You were lined up. It was almost like the fields of battle a couple of hundred years ago. You're lined up on the field, see you there at 8 o'clock in the morning. You line up your forces, I line up my forces, and we have a go at each other. The strongest survives. And the Cold War felt a little bit like that, but with modern military equipment. That's almost certainly not how the wars of the future. It's not going to be necessarily all about the fighters on the ground. It's going to be much more complex than that.
Well, this makes our journey, doing what we're doing, I think important, but certainly very exciting, because the future is very, very uncertain because of all the new ways in which the world has to sustain itself, which is very different from what it was in the past.
No, and I think, and it's one of the motivations for us doing this podcast is for exactly this reason. Is there's lots of melodrama, people talking about World War III, or let's be measured about this. Yes, it might happen. How do you mitigate the risks of that? And that's part of why I think we're looking at, how in the future, how do we spend our defence budget? Do we need more money? Could it be spent smarter? What's the role of NATO? There's lots of really interesting parts, but it isn't just about ships, tanks and aeroplanes. It's also about our critical vulnerabilities in this country.
In one of my other hats, I look at how we can live long, die young. So live to a ripe old age and still have all your faculties and enjoy life. And you've got a colleague, an airman, who has got past 100 years and has still got a lot to say for himself. And he's going to come and join us on the podcast.
Yeah, huge privilege. Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, Distinguished Flying Cross, 103rd birthday just the other day. I still bump into him at the RAF club regularly. He's in there. Yeah, he's a bit hard of hearing, but he's still got all his faculties there. He did 50 missions flying Mosquitoes in World War II over Germany, 13 of those over Berlin, and therefore had actually in the thick of battle. He is an absolutely inspirational character. He's lived, so many questions I've got to ask him, not only about the past, but also are there lessons that endure through to the challenges today. How the hell he's still managing so well at 103. And genuinely, we want as many questions as we can from our viewers to help us. This is a unique opportunity to talk to somebody who was born around the time that the Royal Air Force was born.
Well, I know what you're going to be asking him. I'm going to be asking him what he has for breakfast every day.
What's his trick?